When you hear about the Middle East, you'll think about instability, insurgency, and war. However, did you know this was caused by one man who successfully divided the Muslims? Throughout the 18th and 19th century, the Ottoman Empire were experiencing a slow and steady decline. Once a dominant force in Eastern Europe, it had controlled key cities like Buda and Belgrade, and had even come close to capturing Vienna. By 1914, the empire had lost nearly all its European territory, retaining only Eastern Thrace. Several factors had contributed to the Ottoman contraction within Europe. Internally, corruption was rampant, particularly among the Janissaries, who exploited their power for personal gain. Their resistance to modernization further weakened the empire's military strength. Economically, the Ottomans also struggled due to shifting global trade routes, as well as an over-reliance on an agrarian economy and severe inflation triggered by an influx of precious metals into Europe. Additionally, efforts to modernize the declining empire led to a spiraling debt. However, the greatest challenge that exacerbated the Ottoman decline was the rise of nationalism. For much of Ottoman history, non-Muslims were governed under the Millet system, which allowed religious communities to manage their own personal affairs through independent courts of law. For instance, Jewish and Christian subjects of the empire were given autonomy for religious and personal law. And by the 19th century, ideas of nationalism spread throughout the empire. This was most notable amongst the Christian population living within the Balkans. These groups increasingly demanded autonomy, leading to a series of armed revolts. The first major uprisings occurred in the early 19th century, with the Greeks and Serbs successfully securing autonomy and establishing the First Hellenic Republic and the Principality of Serbia. Nationalist movements spread across the Balkans as the Romanians, Bulgarians, Bosnians, and Montenegrins all launching their own rebellions against the Ottoman Empire. This culminated in a wave of uprisings between 1875 and 1877, so severe that it prompted intervention from the great powers of the time. This conflict escalated into the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878, a crushing defeat for the Ottomans. As a result, Romania, Serbia and Montenegro were all granted official independence. Meanwhile, Bosnia fell under the occupation of Austria-Hungary. However, nationalism was not limited to the Balkans. Arab populations within the Ottoman Empire were also beginning to embrace nationalist sentiments. The first signs of Arab nationalism emerged in the mid-19th century, most notably Rifa al-Tatawi, who argued that the world was composed of nation-states with their own characteristics. Arab nationalism continued to gain traction as the Ottoman Empire weakened and the Arabs perceived the Christian West as superior. They believed that the progress made by the West was due to patriotism. The demands of Arab nationalists varied. Some advocated for a dual Turkish Arab Ottoman Empire, while others, particularly Christian factions, sought complete independence, with some pushing for an autonomous Lebanon. Though what dramatically shifted the landscape of the empire was the Young Turk Revolution of 1908, which ushered in the Second Constitutional Era, and the ruling Committee of Union and Progress promoted a blend of Pan-Turkism, Pan-Islamism and Ottomanism. However, the CUP was largely composed of Turkish nationalists who sought to establish Turkish domination within the empire, alienating Arab populations and fueling their own nationalist sentiments. This led to a surge in Arab intellectual circles fostering nationalist thoughts, giving rise to movements such as Al-Fatah, the Young Arab Society, which was a secret organization advocating for Arab autonomy and independence. And in 1913, Al-Fatah even organized the First Arab World Congress, which brought about many Arab dissidents across the Ottoman Empire to discuss reform and self-determination. You see, by 1914, the Ottoman Empire were on its last legs. It was on the verge of collapse. Firstly, there was a lot of internal strife. The aforementioned Young Turk Revolution of 1908, and then the deposition of Sultan Abdul Hamid II the following year. Additionally, the empire had suffered significant territorial losses between 1911 to 1913, from the Italo-Turkish War to the Balkan Wars. Meanwhile, Europe was descending into chaos, Austria-Hungary had declared war on Serbia in late July 1914, prompting Germany to declare war on France, Belgium and Russia at the start of August. And as a result, the Great War had begun. Initially, the Ottoman Empire maintained neutrality, though it did sign the Ottoman-German alliance, which sought to modernize its army. It also granted Germany access to British colonial territories within the Middle East. In return, Germany promised the Ottomans territorial gains in the Caucasus, northwestern Iran and Trans-Caspia. Tensions escalated further when two German ships, known as the Goeben and Breslau, sought refuge within the Ottoman Empire, fleeing British pursuit, though in order to avoid a diplomatic crisis, the Ottoman Empire purchased the two German ships. However, the vessels remained under German control, further solidifying German influence over Ottoman military affairs. The likelihood of the Ottomans entering the war grew increasingly apparent, but the decisive trigger came on the 29th of October 1914, when Enver Pasha, the Minister of War at the time, arranged for the Ottoman fleet to conduct supposed naval maneuvers across the Black Sea. Instead, under the command of the German Admiral Wilhelm Sorgen, the Ottoman forces launched a surprise raid on the Russian coast. In response, Russia declared war on the Ottoman Empire on the 2nd of November 1914, shortly followed by Britain and France. Meanwhile, the Ottomans officially declared war on the 11th of November 1914, marking their full entry into World War I. Meanwhile, at the same time, the British had seen the rising nationalist sentiment amongst the Arabs and had decided to exploit their resentment towards the Ottoman state. This eventually led to contact being established by the Consul General in Egypt, Lord Kitchener, and Abdullah bin al-Hussein, the second son of Hussein bin Ali, Sharif of Mecca. This was due to the fact that Hussein had grown uncomfortable with the newly appointed Ottoman governor in his Hejaz Vilayet, Wahib Pasha. Furthermore, tensions had risen following the construction of the Hejaz Railway in 1908, which threatened to support increased Ottoman centralization in the region. Discussions culminated in a telegram being sent from Kitchener to Hussein on the 1st of November 1914, where Britain, in exchange for support from the Arabs of the Hejaz, guaranteed the independence, rights and privileges of the Sharifate against all external foreign aggression, in particular that of the Ottomans. This was then followed by the Damascus Protocol, which was a document presented to Prince Faisal bin Hussein in 1915 by two Arab societies, Al-Fatat and Al-Ahad. This outlined demands for recognition of Arab independence in exchange for an Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire. This eventually culminated in the infamous Hussein-MacMahon correspondence. This was a series of letters exchanged between Henry MacMahon and Sharif Hussein of Mecca between 1915 to 1916, in which the British promised the support of an independent Arab state from the south of Yemen to the north of Iraq and Syria, including Palestine, Kuwait, and the entirety of the Arabian Peninsula. In exchange, the Arabs would lead a revolt against the Ottomans. And on the 5th of June 1916, the Arab revolt began. Two of Hussein's sons, the Emirs Ali and Faisal, began the revolt by attacking the Ottoman garrison in Medina. However, they were repelled by a Turkish defense led by Fakhreddin Pasha. Hussein then ordered his supporters to attack the Ottoman garrison at Mecca. He outnumbered, but they were then joined by Egyptian troops sent by the British, who provided much needed artillery support and eventually took Mecca on the 9th of July 1916. Meanwhile, another of Hussein's sons, Abdullah, managed to take Taif by the 22nd of September 1916, and by the end of the month of September 1916, the Sharifian army had taken the coastal cities of Rabigh, Yanbu and Al-Qunfandaha, as well as 6,000 Ottoman prisoners with the assistance of the Royal Navy. In the following month, in October 1916, everything changed as the British sent a young officer by the name of Captain Thomas Edward Lawrence to work with the Hashemite forces in the Hejaz. At the time, the Arab revolt was at a standstill, though Lawrence believed that the reason for this was that the Arabs were missing the right type of leadership. Following a period of meeting with various leaders of the rebellion, Lawrence concluded that Faisal, Hussein's third son, was the correct candidate. This turned the tide of the war in favor of the Arabs, as Lawrence trained the Arab fighters for guerrilla warfare, in which they would use hit-and-run tactics on the Ottomans rather than direct battle. Furthermore, he led attacks on Ottoman supply lines, railways, outposts, and making movement difficult for the enemy. One of his most famous operations was the sabotage of the Hejaz Railway, a key Ottoman supply route from Damascus to the Hejaz. He also helped capture key towns, including Wedge in 1917, securing a Red Sea port for British reinforcements. One of Lawrence's greatest achievements was the capture of Aqaba, a strategically important port. Instead of attacking from the sea, where the Ottomans were prepared, he led a daring desert march from Wadi Rum with Arab forces. The Ottomans were caught off guard, and Aqaba fell on the 6th of July 1917, providing the British a vital base. Lawrence continued coordinating hit-and-run attacks on Ottoman forces. Arab forces, supported by the British, helped push the Ottomans out of key cities like Ma'an and Dara. And at the start of October 1918, the Arab forces entered the city of Damascus in Syria, symbolizing the victory of the revolt. However, Lawrence was simply a tool of Western imperialism, as the British had made several agreements with different European powers regarding the partition of the Ottoman Empire. Firstly, the British, French and Russians formed the Constantinople Agreement of 1915. This guaranteed that the Russians would have Constantinople and the Dardanelles in the event of the Entente victory. This was then followed by a series of talks between the British and French on how to divide up the Ottoman lands. This became known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement. As the English and French diplomats, Mark Sykes and François-Georges Picot negotiated on the new borders of a post-Ottoman Middle East. This agreement effectively divided up the former Ottoman provinces within the Arabian Peninsula between the French and British. The British and French controlled regions would be divided through the Sykes-Picot line. This agreement allocated to the UK control of what is today southern Palestine, Jordan and southern Iraq, and an additional small area that included the ports of Haifa and Acre to allow access to the Mediterranean. And France was to control southeastern Turkey, the Kurdistan region, Syria and Lebanon. Despite the fact that the Bolsheviks actually leaked the secret agreement in December of 1917, however, the British sent the Basset letter, which dismissed the publication of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, in which they stated it was an attempt by the Ottoman Empire to cause mistrust between the Arabs and British during the Arab revolts. Furthermore, by the end of the war, in late 1917, the British issued the Balfour Declaration, promising support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. Just before the war ended, the British Foreign Office discussed Lawrence's Sharifen plan, in which Hussein's sons were promised a puppet monarchy in Syria and Mesopotamia. This was then followed by the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, in which Prince Faisal didn't demand for Arab independence, but rather an Arab state under British mandate. This was then followed by the Sanremo Conference of April 1920, where the Allies decided for mandates in Palestine and Mesopotamia, which would be granted to the British. Meanwhile, in Lebanon and Syria, they would be granted to the French. Despite British promises, France refused to recognize Faisal's rule in Syria, and as a result, the French invaded Syria and defeated Faisal's forces by July 1920. Faisal was forced into exile and the French established direct control over Syria. Though Britain then installed Faisal as the King of Iraq in 1920 as a pro-British monarch. His brother Abdullah was made the Emir of Transjordan, a British protectorate. Both rulers were heavily dependent on British military and financial support. While the Hashemites were struggling in the Levant and Mesopotamia, another power was rising in Central Arabia, the Saudis. Ibn Saud, the leader of the House of Saud, was expanding his power into the Nejd, since the early 1900s. In 1921, Ibn Saud defeated the Rashidis, consolidating his control over Central Arabia. Afterwards, with the help of the Ikhwan, the kingdom of the Hejaz was conquered between 1924 to 1925, and on January 1926, Ibn Saud declared himself the king of the Hejaz. And as a result, by 1925, the dreams of a unified Arab state were dead and buried. The British had achieved what they wanted, control over the Middle East, using Lawrence as a tool of their imperialism. And today, the instability in the region is a direct result of these agreements by the British and the French in the early 20th century.